All right, today we're diving deep into a really important topic, using RTMS, that's repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, to treat obsessive-compulsive disorder. We're going to be looking at a major scientific review that sorts through all the evidence. For a lot of people who don't get better with standard treatments, this is a huge deal. So let's get right to it and see what the data actually tells us about what works, where it works best in the brain, and why. So first things first, let's talk about the sheer scale of the evidence we're looking at here. This isn't just one small study. No, we're talking about a massive analysis that pulled together 47 different high-quality trials. All told, that's data from over 1,600 people. And why does that number matter? Well, it means the conclusions are much more reliable. This gives us a really solid foundation for understanding how effective this therapy actually is. Now, you might be wondering, why is there so much focus on finding new treatments for OCD? Well, the reality is our standard first-line therapies, things like SSRIs and specific psychotherapies, they work for a lot of people, which is great, but they don't work for everyone. In fact, a pretty significant chunk, somewhere around 30 to 40% of individuals, just don't get the relief they need, and that creates this huge, urgent need for other options. That's the gap that RTMS is hoping to fill. And that brings us to RTMS itself. So what is it exactly? Okay, let's break it down. Think of it as a way to, well, gently tune specific parts of the brain without any surgery. It's completely non-invasive. A device with a coil is placed on the head and it sends focused magnetic pulses through the scalp. These pulses create tiny electrical currents in very targeted brain regions. And the whole idea, the goal, is to help normalize the communication in the brain circuits that are known to be out of sync in OCD. Okay, so this really gets to the heart of the problem, what we can call the treatment dilemma. Let's look at the specific number that makes this research so important. And here it is, 30 to 40%. It's really important to let that sink in. We're talking about a huge number of people who are struggling with a very difficult condition and who are often labeled as treatment resistant. This isn't a small niche, it's a major clinical challenge. And it's for this group specifically that RTMS has become such a focus of hope and research. So with all these different studies out there, each one using slightly different methods and getting different results, how do we figure out what's really going on? How do we find the signal in the noise? Well, that's exactly what a systematic review is for. It gathers all the best evidence, analyzes it together, and gives us the big picture. That's what we're using as our guide today to get to the bottom of RTMS for OCD. And the researchers who did this review really emphasize why it's such a big step forward. They point out that by pulling in all the high-quality research from just the last few years, they've basically got the most comprehensive and up-to-date summary that exists. This isn't old news. It's the very latest, most complete picture we have. Okay, let's get into the results. This is where it gets really interesting. The first, and maybe the most critical question the review asks is, where? Where in the brain should we actually be targeting the stimulation? And it turns out the answer is, it matters a whole lot. All right, this table really lays it all out. Let's walk through it. First up, we have the supplementary motor area, or SMA. This is the most studied target, and the results are generally positive. Then you have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC. Here, the results are, well, they're mixed. It seems to depend a lot on the specific protocol. But now look at this third one, the medial prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, or the MPFC/ACC. Even with fewer studies, this area shows the strongest and most consistent evidence. This is the one that really stands out and actually led to FDA approval. Finally, the orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC, has pretty inconsistent results. So the bottom line is clear. Where you target the stimulation makes a huge difference. So just to boil all that down, here's the main takeaway. On one side, you have the most promising targets, the SMA and the MPFC/ACC. That's where the evidence is the strongest. On the other side, you have the DLPFC and the OFC, where the results have been, all over the place. Making this distinction is absolutely crucial for understanding the research. All right, so we've established that where you stimulate is critical, but that's only half the story. The next big question is how you stimulate, and this comes down to frequency. Basically, the speed of the magnetic pulses, measured in hertz, can either ramp up brain activity or calm it down. And this table puts those two pieces, the how and the where, together. You can see that low frequency or 1 hertz stimulation seems to work really consistently on that SMA target we talked about. Then you have higher frequencies like 10 hertz, which can work, but often when combined with something like psychotherapy. But again, look at the standout here, the 20 hertz high-frequency protocol.
When that's aimed at the MPFC/ACC, you get the absolute strongest clinical evidence. That's the real headline.
And this chart just drives that point home. This shows the results from the key clinical trial for that 20 Hz deep TMS protocol, the one that got it cleared by the FDA. Look at the difference. The group that got the real active treatment had a response rate of 38.1%. Now compare that to the placebo group who got a sham treatment. Their response rate was only 11.1%. That's more than a threefold difference. That is a massive, clinically meaningful result.
So let's just state the conclusion as clearly as possible. While there are definitely other promising approaches out there, it's this very specific combination, high-frequency, 20 Hz deep TMS, aimed right at the MPFC/ACC, that has the strongest, most solid evidence from major clinical trials. This is the protocol that met the high standard for regulatory approval.
All right, we've gone through a lot of data here. We've talked about brain targets, we've talked about different frequencies, so let's pull it all together and boil it down to the essential take-home message. So, if you remember just a few things from this analysis, make it these. First, target matters. The SMA and the MPFC/ACC are by far the most promising spots in the brain to target for OCD. Second, frequency is key. Low-frequency 1 Hz stimulation works well on the SMA, while that high-frequency 20 Hz deep TMS is the winner for the MPFC/ACC. And that leads to the final, most important point. The strongest evidence we have comes from that FDA-cleared protocol. It showed response rates that were significantly, and I mean significantly, better than a placebo.
And this all leads to a really interesting final thought. What this review really shows is that the conversation has shifted. We're not just asking, does RTMS work anymore? Now the question is, how can we make it work best for each individual? The future seems to be all about personalizing this treatment, maybe using brain scans or other biomarkers to pick the perfect target and frequency for each person. So the big question that leaves us with is, how far away are we from that future? When will this kind of personalized approach become a reality for the people who need it most?